feel like bravery is something that we actually put on, we kind of judge other people by or label other people by. It's not really your individual perspective. And certainly at that time, it was not like, I'm going to go home and be a big brave girl. Not at all. It was like, if I don't do this, I'm dead. My soul is dead. I will never be happy.
Welcome to Her Brave Story podcast, conversations that spark courage, heal, and celebrate the brave in every woman. If we haven't met before, I'm your host, Chrystal Dawn, saltwater mama, women's coach, and storyteller. Today, I am so honored to welcome our first ever guest to Her Brave Story podcast, Angie Richard. Angie is an Australian mother of three, award-winning multidisciplinary storyteller, producer, and academic. Angie's work spans over 2 decades as an outdoor and adventure travel writer, filmmaker, and creative researcher. She's produced award-winning projects, including a UN climate security documentary and the immersive VR natural history series Ecosphere. She's now producing Women and the Wind, a breathtaking eco-adventure documentary, now premiering. Her story is one of deep transformation, from leaving her marriage to raising her sons as a single mother, to building a beautiful new chapter with her husband of 7 years, Remy, and their baby daughter. Through her Floating Stories Lab and her Substack Kinscript, Angie is helping us reimagine storytelling as a path towards connection, healing, and regenerative futures. Today, we talk about motherhood, starting over, finding creative purpose, and the courage it takes to live life on your own terms. I am so excited to welcome Angie to the podcast. Let's dive in, brave soul. Hi, Angie.
Hello.
Welcome to Her Brave Story podcast. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
I'm so excited to have this window with you. It feels so special and sacred in this motherness that we're both in.
Likewise.
Angie, I'd love for you to speak to what it is that you do and a little bit about who you are, and in particular about multidisciplinary storytelling.
You said it well. Such a tongue twister. You started on point. The first thing that I always say that I am is a mom. And I've been a mum now for 15 years and I'm 41. So that's like 3/4 of my adult life. So that would be probably what I'm the most experienced in, mumming. But yeah, I started my career in print, magazine, journalism as a surf writer in Japan. I started to weave in my real passions of environmental and humanitarian storytelling into that surf culture storytelling. That evolved into travel and outdoor writing, editing for magazines, to digital publications. That evolved accidentally into filmmaking and, VR. So that, just came to be like, I'm essentially a storytelling artist, and how can we best describe that as multidisciplinary?
I love storytelling artist.
I don't really like labels so much, but we have to answer these questions of who we are professionally.
I love that. Multidisciplinary sounds like it really covers quite a bit. I love how you say accidental filmmaker, went into this, went into that, and yet all of it sounds like it's been a continuation of your passions.
Yeah, absolutely. I learned a methodology in my master's degree this year, Auto-Ethnography. I can just give you an overview of what it means to me is learning about the world through actual experience, like through lived experience. What just came naturally for me, going out, traveling around, being immersed in communities and having conversations with people and learning about different cultures, and then facilitating those stories. That's an actual academic word for it. And it sounds fancy. It sounds legitimate. I just thought I was the loose cannon on this wild, winding path. Turns out it's very normal and legitimized in academia. So there you go. Fantastic. I feel so validated.
That's right. Now you have a title, a label.
Yeah. Like, wow.
Tell us about where you started a new story, in particular about Colombia, where you took a massive risk in going a new direction, a moment that really catalyzed the trajectory of where where you started and where you are now, and it informs your work.
Well, you picked a good one, Colombia. To get to that point is essentially, the tipping point story. I was in a very toxic marriage, my first marriage, for almost a decade, and I'd been living in Japan. I was pregnant with Hunter, my second. I had Ryder, who was a toddler. We faced the 2011 Fukushima disaster, which was caused by the earthquake and the tsunami. We chose to relocate back to Australia after several months of evacuation. And back in Australia, where I had hoped that being back there would improve the marital situation, it only deteriorated, got essentially worse for a multitude of reasons. What happened to me personally was being home, getting a good job and flipping to being the primary breadwinner of the family empowered me personally. I was traveling a lot at the time, once back in Australia for work as a travel editor. But my boys were really little and my ex-husband wasn't really coping. And so everything just sort of getting worse and worse. And then I was made redundant of my job and I went back to freelance. But the turning point came when myself and my girlfriends, Sybil Still and Lauren Hill, co-founded V-Day Byron Bay. And we were putting on the Vagina Monologues to raise money for domestic violence survivors.
Which is where I also got to spend time with you.
Yes, this is where we started to hang out and meet each other properly. The night before the first event on Sybil's deck, I blurted out some big secrets about what I was keeping to myself, what I'd been living through for many years. So just getting that out was already a huge turning point. And following that, I was invited to Peru as a surfing travel journalist to go and document the emerging surf scene over there. And what ended up happening was really profound on both levels because I was at a place I'd wanted to surf my entire life. I was standing in front of Chicama, arguably the world's longest left-hander. I'm a goofy footer, which means I like surfing left. And for years, I'd really put aside my surf travel dreams that I'd had when I first originally went to Japan. I was only going to Japan for a year. I wanted to continue traveling around the world as a photojournalist, as an essayist, commenting on culture. Everything kind of got shelved. My ex-husband was a photographer, and then I put the camera away and sort of stepped into his shadow, slowly emerged as a writer and an editor, but was always in the background and just not necessarily doing what I had set out to do and accepting that as my fate in the end. And then I was standing at Chicama and I went out and surfed Chicama. And this wave it's just an incredible wave. I was reinvigorated. And after the surf, I was standing up on the cliff and I was like, wow, when I left university at 20 years old, 21 years old, this was my dream. Traveling around the world, surfing and documenting culture. And I was just like, what are you doing? All of this internal dialogue came. The next week I spent up in the north, higher in a place called Lobitos. The surf there is epic too. What I saw was this emerging surf culture at the same time, age-old oil infrastructure, just not the right environmental development support for this town to cope with. I saw a documentary in it and a story I wanted to tell. And my mentor was Taylor Steele. I was like, Taylor, we're going to do a documentary on this. And he was like, you should do it. It's just like doing a magazine editorial, only you do it visually. That's how I fell into filmmaking. I was preparing to go back to my husband and say, it's done. We're done. That was really a complete pivotal turning point, that trip to Peru. Essentially, the interesting thing about all of that was when I'd made that decision, finally, I'd been wanting to leave on and off for years, and then you're kind of financially trapped and you've got little kids and you don't want to tell anyone. There's so much stigma about abusive relationships and you wear all of that on your shoulders, and so many women don't leave because of this. But once I knew, like in every bone, muscle, fiber of my being, cell of my being, that I was definitely out, And the surf and the project idea that I had was so liberating and just so exciting that it propelled me with the strength to get out of that relationship. I was on this high for quite a while. And then the reality of stepping out of what I'd been in as a single mom then, with society's hostilities towards single mothers and their children, everything just comes crashing down for me within a year. You realize you're financially and there is not really any support. You're an independent creative with, a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old completely dependent on you, with an ex-husband who's now gone back to his country and not contributing a cent. And you're in debt from before that when you evacuated your family over, and all the debts in your name because he hadn't a visa at that time. And what happened to me was all of that pressure mounted on top of trying to do this documentary project. And what happened eventually was coming to this point where I was in so much debt. And I got the film out and I was working on another documentary with my friends in Lennox Head, Dustin Hollick and Rian Slap the Laps in Tasmania. And I wanted to keep doing this storytelling work, but I felt the pressure of domestication as a single mom. The balance sheet was not evening out. Like, I just kept going under and under and under. And how could I progress creatively? How could I pitch for film financing? How could I work on this stuff that was like in my being, everything that I wanted to do, while having to be a mom and trying to juggle this? Nothing was evening out.
I'd love to stop here for a moment, because I'd love to explore a little bit about what happened in Peru, because what I'm hearing is that you had something inside of you that wanted to come out, and you hadn't done a film before. You had been a writer, you'd been storytelling, and you wanted to take your storytelling into video and audio as well. You saw an opportunity. And I'm so curious, because that sounds like it catalyzed the decision-making around what followed with your separation. And can you speak to if it was having the space that made that possible for you, or it was opening your eyes, or actually bringing to life this new project?
When I went to Peru, when the relationship was just clearly never going to end up working after 2 kids, and this just cycle of abuse was just not going to end. And for the sake of my boys too, to get them away from that environment so that didn't infiltrate how they saw that women could easily be treated. When I was standing on that cliff in Chicama after surfing this wave, it was like, this is what I was trying to do 10 years ago. And I would like to say that at the time I was really looking into this kind of crazy energy that you get from being in the desert in Peru. It's really, really hard to describe. But I come from Adelaide and I grew up surfing the West Coast, where it's very, very remote. There's a lot of dirt. There's a lot of rocks. It's cold water.
So really wild.
I couldn't describe what was happening to me, but honestly, in the space of 30 minutes after this surf, watching the sunset and standing alone on this cliff, I went back to my room in the little resort we were staying in Chicama, and everything was so clear. Just everything was clear. So it's not necessarily, I was just talking to my husband this morning, my now husband. I'm remarried. He's lovely. I love him to pieces. He's just the opposite. We were talking about bravery before coming on this podcast. Obviously, your theme is brave and brave stories. In those moments, you're not like, I'm going to be brave. Feel like bravery is something that we actually put on, we kind of judge other people by or label other people by. It's not really your individual perspective. And certainly at that time, it was not like, I'm going to go home and be a big, brave girl. Not at all. It was like, if I don't do this, I'm dead. My soul is dead. I will never be happy. And for 7 or 8 years at that point, I had kind of just, and this happens a lot with abuse survivors, had thought that it was my fate, that I would have to compromise and sacrifice all the things that I had dreamed about that weren't happening. I would just have to suck that up. In that moment in Peru, the complete opposite occurred. And so the idea to make the film was also similar, because I was essentially a guest of the Peruvian Tourism Board and the government. And my responsibility in return was to write about that in all kinds of magazines. I wanted to make this more eco-adventure documentary instead, which ended up getting a lot of attention, and worked to support the local Peruvian surfers to actually have their surf breaks protected in national law. That was the story I wanted to tell. And so that pissed off a lot of people too. But at the time, for me, maybe I was just completely in my own bubble, and maybe a bit arrogant and selfish too. I think because what was happening alongside this desire to tell this story and to make this documentary was also this other transformation out of this abusive relationship that these folks couldn't see. That was more an internal thing, but they were happening in tandem, right?
Parallel
yeah,
stories.
And they were supporting each other. So for me, it became like, absolutely, there's no question now that I'm leaving this relationship, and absolutely, there's no question I'm going to do this documentary, no matter what it takes. I'd actually intended to just write the doco and have Taylor Steele direct it. He was like, but this is the fire in you. I'll just help you find the right team to shoot it and put it together, but you have the absolute capability to tell this story. And that was really cool too, because for so many years, I'd had this other man in my life tell me that I was not capable. And then I had someone like Taylor Steele, who I respected so much, and his then wife, Sybil, who's one of my best friends, who's, you know, the producer, the organizer. I had their mentorship say, absolutely, you can do this. Go for it. To be honest, the scariest thing was, after several months had passed, going home, getting this film Double Barrel out there, realizing my financial situation. So what happens with trauma survivors a lot is we become hyper independent. I started to ignore the reality of my financial situation. I was on this high after this years of suppression. I just started to ignore that, and then it becomes to a point where you can't ignore it. So going to Colombia, for example, was not so much a courageous decision in my mind. It was a logical step. I wanted to be close to my kids. I wanted them to have this other outside perspective of life and education. I wanted to continue doing this work. Beautiful. I had a cool lover. He was super nice to the kids. I was also okay if that was just a short-term thing. So many single moms are so afraid to get into new relationships when they have kids. I was not like that. For me, I'd already been in one of the worst situations that I could be in front of my kids, that anything else would be a lot of a better positive example for them. And I also wanted to show them that if that boyfriend didn't turn out, that I'm okay. We'll just keep going on, which is what happened in the end, actually. And we had no choice but to educate them on the reality of life, is that some relationships don't last, and that there are healthy ways to come out of them, actually. So that was all how we ended up in Colombia.
I love that. And I love all the nuances in here. I'd love to, for a moment, just unpack a couple of things. When I hear you have this revelation when you're in Peru, you said it suddenly was clear to you. It's like the veil was taken down. You had a renewed sense of clarity that had taken you years to find. You had the clarity that gave you some kind of idea of what to do next. And then you had to take action on that. So you did take action. You didn't just have the vision and then do nothing. You actually took the action. You came home, things changed. And I want to speak also to this idea of hyper independence from trauma as well, and that women also are conditioned in a masculine power system that we have to keep doing as well, that our value is seen when we create a product versus who we are. And I love this shift that you make, where you go into the feminine power, which is to call in more resources to say, I actually have to turn towards the thing that I haven't been turning towards, because it's super uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable to turn towards the debt and towards all the the hard stuff that's been happening. And for so many women, we don't turn towards the hard things. We just keep going over here to busy ourselves with the stuff.
I was forced to turn to it. I'm trying to raise money for this next film project. I'm having smaller projects commissioned. I am like non-stop working. I have my 3-year-old home with me 3 or 4 days a week because I can't afford childcare. And Ryder by this time was at school. And you know, the school window is like what, 9:30 till 3 or something. There's not a lot of time in between to do all the things and then like clean a house and all the domesticated we're expected to do. Right? At the time, I was entitled to some benefits for being a single mom in Australia, not enough to survive on, and I'm working on top. And then as you earn more, your benefits. There's not a special selection for abuse survivor who's dealing with all this debt and the father is not paying child support because he went back to his country and there's no agreement with Australia, so child support couldn't chase any money. And there's no special section for that. It's black or white, and I never fit in one of the black or white boxes. I was forced to deal with the financial situation. I went and borrowed money off a friend, which I paid back. I almost went bankrupt, basically. And we're talking not that much money in the scope of I didn't have a home loan. I just had this debt from relocating my family, and it was so infuriating for me. 2 things happened. I wanted to get out of Australia, and I knew that I could survive on my freelance writing by not living in Australia and traveling around. That way I could be with my kids, educate them better in the world, keep doing my research and the work that I'd already felt I'd suppressed for nearly a decade. And I didn't want to have to stop that after having this, you know, wow, this is what I wanted to do. Now I can do it. And then you get divorced and then you're a single mom. And then it's like, but can I really keep doing that? And I was determined by that point. You can have it all. So having it all means you have to do it all. And if you're doing it all, you're not being the best mother and you're not being the best storyteller. That you can't have it all and do it all and do it all well. Over the years, I started to realize that that was true.
100%, especially if you want to parent a certain way without that long-term separation from your child and be involved in their life. There's so much pressure for women, period, in our society. And when it comes to mothering, additional pressure. And then you put that again with single mothering, then we're talking like way overhead with what's achievable, what you can even do, what other people think of you, how you can even navigate moving forward in certain situations whilst trying to parent the way you want to parent, whilst trying to co-parent, whilst dealing with trauma or with legislation or governmental issues.
There's no time to deal with your trauma.
No, there's none. And it ends up being a loss for your children.
This hyper independence. Like there was no time for me to deal with my trauma. I was seeing a friend who was a life coach. She was really helping me, and she was like, you're not seeing this now, but you're suffering from PTSD. You were in a natural disaster and then you're grieving the breakdown of your marriage. And at the same time, I'd been at a shark attack just shortly after my divorce as well. That one that happened in Ballina, the Japanese surfer passed
away. Which was fatal.
Yeah. Yeah, it was fatal. I was there just as he was being brought in. So all these things like compounded and happened. And I was just like, there's no capacity to cope. Or I'm running on like 1,000,000 miles per hour. But that's this survival mechanism. And then it was like, what do I do now? And my ex-husband was begging to see the kids. So I went to Japan after Colombia because, you know, you only get 3 months travel visas too. So we went back to Japan, but I refused to be close to him. So the kids and I spent 3 months in the mountains snowboarding, which was so cool. But what happened was like that 3 months was coming to an end again, visa. I was starting to run out of money. I had to make this decision that I really didn't want to do, was go back to Australia to reset and figure out what I wanted to do next. And I ended up going back to Oz, but I could not find temporary rental that was affordable. So we decided we can camp at Lake Ainsworth Holiday Park, which, mind you, is at the time $300 a week for a non-powered tent site. I went to the
Crazy.
camping store and I bought a tent, and I bought one for me, had to have my own, one for the boys. We set up opposite the lake, opposite the beach. And Hunter still looks back and says that was the best time of his childhood, camping.
It's an extraordinary place, though, that the Tea Tree Lake and the ocean right there. I mean, you're talking footsteps. Just for people who don't know, this place is incredibly beautiful. It's surrounded with gum trees and
so pretty. And ducks. My neighbors were ducks. This is when India started coming up again. And my parents had been in the Himalayas in Nepal, and I really had wanted to do this for so long. I started to tie this in with my own healing, this trauma healing. I recognized that I was racing around and I needed to figure out how I could sustain this, because I knew I didn't want to settle down in Australia, and I wanted to keep being kind of semi-nomadic, but it had to be less fast-paced and more for my own work, but also for the boys. By this time, they were 5 and 7. I wanted to go and do a trek in the Himalayas. And there was a women's abuse agricultural farm that a friend, Alexa, had volunteered at. She was like, you've got to go there. They want you to teach storytelling stuff. They've got their own radio station where they're telling their own stories. And this is where I started to realize that there are so many other people in the world going through even worse than what I went through, but they're telling their own stories and they're facilitating community stories, and they're doing this in this really healthy way. And I really wanted to learn from them, to get out of my kind of white feminist, white privilege, and learn from other women in the world. That became a central, really important thing for me.
Sorry, where was that? Where was this place?
That's in Nepal. So I had this plan to go to Nepal and do this trek. And then I'd been to India. They need to see India, and then we'll just cross over into Nepal. So I developed this idea where we would cross Asia from India to Japan over winter. That was just the timing.
Very ambitious as well, with the boys on your own.
Using no plastics and going on my own. And so I started to develop this idea from the campground in Lennox Head. And I met this traveling French man whilst I was on my man ban. Actually, the local mums were like, have you met Remy staying with our friends, Angel and Ollie? And I'm like, no, and I definitely don't want to. At the young Colombian, I'm not going with the young Frenchman. No way. But May turned into June and it started to get a little cold in the tent. So I said yes. And what was supposed to be a very short love affair is now 7 years together, several years of marriage and a daughter. So
congratulations.
He came with us on that trip. And that's, to me, that was actually probably one of the bravest things. Looking back, I feel that was a brave choice, because he was this young, he's 9 years younger than me, and he was traveling around free, working holiday. And we got along so well together. Camping is a great place to start a relationship. Camping with kids. If you can't get along in that scenario, it's probably not going to work in any other scenario. But we were really honest with each other. We got through that whole trip and it kept going from there. But he is the one who said to me, Angie, why are you so addicted to struggle? No, it's just like, excuse me? How dare you say that to me? He said this to me when we were living in the tents. I think I was trying to carry all the groceries, and he was like, give me a bag. And I was like, no, I got it. And I was always like that. And I had to, for the first time, I want to take my 5-year-old and 7-year-old to the Himalayas with no money and go across Asia with backpacks. And I was going to do it all by myself with them. Maybe there's an element of struggle that I'm kind of enjoying. And in later life now, I've learned that that's a trauma response, this hyper independence. And that trip really took off the romanticism of the struggle, because we were really exposed to the challenges that many people in other parts of the world live through. I remember wanting to invite some of the girls from her farm on my trek, doing this trek to raise awareness about domestic violence, and asking the organizer, the woman who ran the organization, do you think some of the girls will want to come? And they're like, Angie, we live in the foothills of the Himalayas. We have to walk kilometers and kilometers carrying every day. Trekking is not a hobby for us. That's your Western, ideology. And that was just the beginning of this unraveling for me and really learning that there's so many other ways to see the world. And I need to really slow down now and see that.
And I love that you've brought your boys into the center of where you are as well. They're part of the adventure. And as we move into women
in the wind.
And then your personal project that you're working on and how these lead into each other, but how your children, they're also in the center of this for you. Even though you're hyper independent, you're trying to do everything, they're also there with you. They're also a part of it.
I just felt like I had no choice, And that's not true. That's also a privileged statement. Like, I guess you're faced with a number of choices, and I made mine. And I was criticized by some and judged by others. Someone asked my mom, are you worried about Angie with all that she's doing and all these travels, and now she's taking your grandsons? And she was like, well, I stopped worrying about that years ago because I know she's just going to do it anyway. We filmed the whole trip across India, across Asia, and made like a little YouTube series and for ourselves called Crossing Asia. We watched it back together. And it's so funny because it's not funny, but you see the boys crying as they're dealing with altitude issues going up 4,500 meters in the Himalayas, and they're crying and they're struggling and they're laughing at themselves now. Like, oh God, it just should have been tougher or whatever. I think that we try to protect our kids as much as possible, but it's not like I wanted to force them into toughening up or anything like that, because I think there's so much negative out of that, particularly with boys and masculinity. Like, you've got to have this top. I just wanted them to see the rest of the world, to have a wider perspective. I wanted to not be the one to come home from all these trips and go, oh, this is what I saw and this is how it made me feel. I wanted to learn with them, and to learn from them, because they bring up stuff from our trip that Remy and I don't even remember. And we're like, oh, that's stuck in your mind? That's incredible. We'd forgotten about that. And so what happened after all of that was reality kicked me in the guts again, finances and visas. Remy couldn't go back to Australia really, and I'm freelance, so I can kind of be anywhere, and the kids are already adaptable, and we all were really, really tired. We lived in Canada for 6 months and we didn't want to leave there. We were in Montreal. We absolutely loved it, but the visa issue came up. So Remy's French. We came to France as his grandfather was dying, and then it was just like, oh, well, we should just stay here for a year. That's always a year. It's 5 years later. And we went into probably my most challenging period, which was settled. What that did was allowed me to go into some deeper work and other collaborations. I started working on a virtual reality series, and I went away again for work and leaving my kids back with Remy. And the work that I was able to do was really incredible, because I was bringing all this experience I'd had for the years and hadn't probably digested it. And then I was finding it was naturally infiltrating and influencing this work. So that took over and took me to another level of my professional career. But I came back to the same original issue that I had years before. I was now leaving my family again to fly to Kenya to do 2 weeks there and wanting to travel with them. So I had developed this idea of creating a floating stories lab, which is a research and storytelling sailboat studio that Remy and I were developing the idea for it during COVID lockdown. I'd just come back from filming in Raja Ampat, and I'd seen a sailboat come into where we were staying, and I realized that you could go kind of anywhere in the world in a sailboat. And like, as a surfer and a traveler who now wanted a stable home but wanted to keep moving around, a sailboat was like, oh my God, this is the most brilliant idea I've ever had. And COVID hit. We started to look at what kind of sailboat we might want to get, and do we want to refurbish one. I learned this research by a scientist in Brighton in the UK Dr. Chrystal, who discovered the impact of fiberglass on marine ecosystems, particularly oysters and mussels. And coming from 3 generations of surfboard shapers and being a surfer, I've always known fiberglass is a yucky material. But we've not really seen to really develop further from that. So then we didn't want a fiberglass boat, and we started looking into aluminium or steel, but they're super expensive. Now, this time I started following this girl on Instagram, Kiana Waltzian, who was renovating this 50-year-old wooden catamaran and was going to take it across the North Atlantic Ocean with 2 other women. She's usually a solo sailor. And they did this Kickstarter, and I was just kind of loosely watching it. This Kickstarter to do a doco on it called Women in the Wind, and I was really excited to see it come out. And then Kiana contacted me on Instagram and was like, would you review a rough cut of the film? We would like your, storyteller opinion. And the feedback I gave them ended up reopening the edit, and then I came on board as a producer, and I've been working with the girls since. But they crossed the Atlantic on this wooden boat called Marinoka. I was like, talk about brave. Wow. This is huge. These girls are amazing. I learned about James Wareham Designs, which is the designer of these catamarans, and the women who propped up his decades career. These are Polynesian double canoes. He was really inspired by the Polynesians. Kiana introduced me to Hanneke Boone, who is the head of Wareham Designs now. She's been working with them for 50 years. James passed away a few years ago. Hanneke's this powerhouse woman. We, as a family, went and stayed on board her 63-foot pahi called Spirit of Gaia in Portugal. And it was like, okay, we're going to build one of these, a 41-foot boat. So everything kind of like, my daughter just got
hear
home.
Your daughter. Yeah,
she can't be in the same room with me. So that's kind of like where we're at now. I've been working on the film with the girls for a year. It's coming out in the spring. And Remy and I are going to start building our own wooden catamaran. We're going to try and do it with biocomposite materials as much as possible. So I've been doing a lot of research into this, and essentially the boat project, once it launches, will live on it. And whether my teen boys, who will, by the time we finish building in 2-3 years, Ryder will be 18.
Wow.
So whether he will come and join us, I hope, he just has an open door. He can come as long as he wants, whenever he wants. We will live on the boat and then host other storytellers. And this is like my entire life's work, cultivating this idea. I want to continue researching like regenerative futures, but have a home base, the boat, have my family, and then invite others on board and see the perspective of the world from this humbling place called the ocean, which ties back to, what happened to me in Peru, how the ocean invigorated the way I saw myself and the world.
The boat is not a fixed place as well, because it seems like for Angie, if she's going to be in one place, it's got to be moving.
Yeah.
So you've found a way to solve it. In terms of your life work, you're finding ways to meet your needs and to meet the needs of your family, to keep your family as a part of this as well.
As a human species, we've migrated, and everything around us has been in flux. Nothing's static. The tides are not static. Humans and bugs and butterflies, and nothing is static. Everything moves, and we've all moved for different reasons. I feel like I moved for my own survival mentally. For my mental health, I needed to keep moving, but I also need periods of stability. We just moved, speaking of moving, we just moved to Brittany from the southwest of France, and it feels incredible. We have a 500,000-year-old Paleolithic grotto archaeological site 10 minutes on foot from my house. Just talk about culture opening us up to our own, I guess, my own European ancestral history, and learning how much we've had to adapt and move and migrate and change the way we see the world.
Yes.
So hard for me to concentrate now.
You're doing so well. And look, it's so beautiful as well to see you in this, because
I'm going to breastfeed her while we're chatting.
You are such a creative powerhouse, Angie, to see the things that you've been through, to hear the things that you've been through personally, and know that you've continued to be a prolific creator through that. And you've found ways to continue to explore the world and the depth of who you are as well, which does take a tremendous amount of courage. And I'd love to know if there's anything that comes through you or over you to keep you going, or do you just have that innate fire to continue to create, to continue to explore and to be curious?
Yeah, I love it. I also just really think that we need storytellers and creatives and artists and designers are really, really essential. The world is currently experiencing the highest level of conflict since World War II. And we really need the storytellers, the artists, the designers, the creative people to facilitate the stories, to remind us all of our own humility. And the theory that I'm grounding all my work in now is regenerative futures. So it's going beyond sustainability to think about regeneration. And this is really natural intelligence. Nature, wherever possible, chooses cooperation instead of competition. And Lee Gorison writes about this. If you ask a wildlife photographer how many hours, days, weeks, or months they had to shoot to get that scene of the animals fighting each other, because most of the time they're just cooperating, they're just coexisting. So our survival, our evolution is actually dependent on cooperation. And I have felt personally that the more I get out of my bubble and the more I open myself to serendipity, the more I can remember that, because it's just natural intelligence. We have traditional ecological knowledge no matter where we're from, because that's how things, were. So going out into the world is my way of reminding myself. My husband was saying to me, keep my wife happy, just got to take her on walks. That's how I survive settlement. Like I don't like shopping, and I'm not the most social person these days. I bring my family outside together. It's who I am. It was at 41 that I came across the term auto-ethnography, and I felt legitimized instead of stigmatized. Just crucial to my mental health to keep learning.
Wow, so powerful. I feel like I could sit with you forever and hear more of your wisdom and your medicine and your stories. And I'm just so grateful that you've taken so much time with us today. And it was so sweet and tender seeing you breastfeeding as well, and having the sweet sounds just rocks my soul. The mothering, it's a part of the life that you're living in your being. You're living and breathing it, continuing to experiment. And this is something that I really hope to encourage other women to do, is to keep being curious, to keep experimenting, and to be curious about unconventional lives. And this is really what Her Brave Story is also about.
I want to close kind of on this side by saying that the whole Floating Stories Lab project is about sharing now. I want to stand back to a degree and work on projects that require me to think longer. There's this turnaround, especially when I worked in virtual reality, there's this short frame turnaround to get these stories out there. And I feel like I need to work on stuff that might take me 3 or 4 years to think about now. At the same time, there's an urgency to get stories out there too, because there's a lot going on in the world. But the Floating Stories Lab is really a place where people can come as a community project. But we have to build it first. And we're inviting people to come, because there's a process too, understanding supply chains and how toxic a lot of these materials are in boat building or surfboard making. And so there's a process in the actual creation of the vessel itself that will take the next 2 to 3 years. That's quite fascinating.
Wow. How can people find you then? What's the best way for people to follow your work and learn more about what you do?
So
Tell us the places.
I have 2 websites, Voyage Raj, which is the Floating Stories Lab. It's like family media site, and the Anicha Way is my personal storytelling studio. That's where my documentaries are. I really encourage everyone to check out the trailer for Women in the Wind. And I'm a part of the Women in the Wind Foundation that Kiana has created, which is to support with fiscal sponsorship and mentoring other eco-adventure females who are focused on female-led solutions to man-made problems. So
great. I love that.
it doesn't have to be sailing at all. So we're going to be launching, and I really think it's going to be an amazing project. I'm just so thrilled to be involved in that now and sort of stepping into more of a mentor role, more of facilitating other people to tell the stories that they want to tell and share the issues that are important to them, because they're all really important. I want to share and help other women, particularly single mothers especially. I feel like it's this not untapped potential, because they want to contribute so much, but like we were saying before, you're just trying to survive, and
under-resourced.
it's so hard to have the resources to do that work. I was particularly stubborn and just went and did it anyway, but that is just not really recommended, because my mental health suffered, and then your kids are suffering too. So I think we urgently need to hold space and create more community for single mums to be able to express their creativity, because they've been through a lot and they see the world in a way that's really important.
Absolutely. As also a single mom and who's gone through those things too, I definitely have a big heart for single moms. I know exactly what you're talking about in terms of this can really break you open as well. For some people, it can actually be the catalyst for massive change, and having the right kind of support to be able to unleash that creative fire is absolutely essential.
Yeah.
When women and the wind. Yeah.
Working on this end of April, May for the events. And then we hope to be on digital streamers by the middle of the year, kind of in those sales talks now. Yes, darling, you can't wait as well. I think everyone is going to love this film. Kiana is just incredible. Leke and Elisa. Elisa is the cinematographer. Her work is just absolutely stunning. Leke is just an incredible woman who's really passionate about ocean plastics and cleaning up plastics from the ocean. That's essentially the underlying theme behind the film, is the girls following the flow of plastics across the North Atlantic. There's a lot of talk about the Pacific plastics in the Pacific Ocean, but not a lot in the North Atlantic. And so they set up to follow that and focus on that. And then the adventure out of their hands took over. I mean, they got hit by 3 low pressure systems in the North Atlantic Ocean on this wooden sailboat that's 50 years old that they had refitted for nearly 2 years by themselves,
Wow.
And that's when, for me, this film that particularly I was passionate about it is because it's like a mirror of my life. You set out to do something, and then
the storms come.
Takes on a life of its own. And I feel like we're just so used to trying to control outcomes. And the girls were incredible in how they were talking about this, the times when you need to fight and times when you need to surrender. This film is really about fighting for what they believe in terms of not being able to get any financial backing to make this doco and to go on this adventure. So fighting and doing the refit by themselves with no money, and then going out and doing it. But then Mother Nature is like, you're not going to fight me and win. You're going to have to surrender to everything I throw at you. So it's really, really an incredible film. And it's so beautifully shot. You become a passenger on this story. Wow. It's a very different kind of documentary. It's observational, and you really feel like you were on this. And I think it's going to inspire a lot of people.
Oh, beautiful. I love the sound of it. I looked at the trailer and I've been following along a little bit on social media. So I'm excited about that. And I'm super excited about your Floating Stories Lab too, and watching that coming together. What an incredible partnership to be in. And congratulations. And we didn't get to talk about so many things, Angie, that you've been through. I'd love to have you on again another time, because there's so much that you bring to being a woman in the world.
Now I have to surrender to a very tired and hungry child.
You've done an incredible job, and thank you so much. I just want to say from the bottom of my heart, I really appreciate you, and I appreciate your belief in me as well, and coming on this and being a part of my new project, of this new experiment where my own curiosity leads me. So thank you for supporting women who are trying new things as well.
Of course. Congratulations too. I'm excited to hear all the episodes that come forward from here.
Thank you. Thank you. Sending you so much love. Wow. There was just so much gold in this conversation with Angie. She is a creative powerhouse with such depth, wisdom, and heart. I hope that you had a Me Too moment somewhere in there. Maybe when she named the quiet ache of hyper independence, or when she reminded us of how deeply the world needs more storytellers. Her story is such a beautiful reminder that we don't have to do it all alone, and that beginnings can come in the most unexpected chapters of our lives. To explore more of Angie's world, including Floating Stories Lab, her Substack, and her film Women and the Wind, head to herbravestorypodcast.com, where you'll also find some awesome extras, discounts from our sponsors, and free resources. And if you've ever thought about starting your own podcast, I used Riverside FM to record and edit this episode. It's simple, intuitive, and completely online. You'll find the link in the show notes to get you rolling. Thank you for joining our circle. I trust her lessons and courage help you grow your own greatness, and that you share this episode with someone who needs to hear her brave story, because we all deserve to create lives we truly love. I'll be right here waiting for you whenever you hit play, with a smile and your weekly dose of sister talk, because women's stories matter. Until next time, remember that you are worth it, and thrive on, brave soul.